Video game film adaptations have been disappointing critics and fans longer than the mediums themselves have existed. The stench of early films like Street Fighter, Lara Croft, and Doom were so bad that it's entirely possible settlers making the treacherous trek down the Oregon Trail could have smelled them from 150 years off. Recently, however, there seems to be a shift in the tide of adaptations, and for some reason or other, those in charge of the big screen projects appear to be understanding the assignment given to them and respecting the properties handed their way in a manner that hadn't yet been seen up to this recent point. In this three-part project, I want to dive back into the annals of film and video game history and take you all on a small trip through the lost eras of video game movies and television. Before we start, I think it's a very worthy thing to acknowledge that there are hundreds of adaptations of every sort, and to go through them would take a much lengthier investigation. Unfortunately, if you had a raging curiosity about 2007's Elf Bowling the movie, The Great North Pole Elf Strike, you may be sorely disappointed. Today, my intention is to focus on the major theatrical films that were released primarily in the United States between the years 1993 to 2003. The first era of video game movies I am entitling the Inception Era. Additionally, in my discussion of these films and their reception, I will be using the Rotten Tomatoes scores. I personally place more weight in the user scores than I do in the critic scores, but I'll be mentioning both. User scores are nearly always higher than the critics, but I feel they are a slightly more objective metric to judge these movies by. Users are often fans of the source material, whereas critics are simply reviewing another film in their lineup and can give films bad marks based upon them feeling like video games or not understanding the material. The Super Mario Bros. Movie from 2023 is a fantastic example, as critics are full-blown rotten on the film, placing it at 59%, but users are at 95%. It was commercially a success, and any Mario fan had a great time with it. The egghead critics, however, were simply confused, mauling, and pissed themselves over not understanding game logic or Mario references. That all being said, let's move on to the grandfather of video game movies, a film we all know too well, Super Mario Bros. No, not the aforementioned 2023 animated film, the live-action movie directed by Annabelle Jankel and Rocky Morton, a husband and wife duo. It was the first feature-length video game film, and the directors certainly had their work cut out for them. Their mission? Pave the way for generations of video game films, ingratiate the genre into the cultural landscape, and put some respect on Mario and Luigi's name.
Yeah, that's not gonna happen.
As we will shortly see, the Dreamer couple did at least one of those things. They did indeed pave the way for decades of horse-piss video game adaptation drivel. When the movie was released, it was panned by nearly every critic and grossed $38 million worldwide. A shameful number for a movie that utilizes the IP of the most well-known video game character in history. Not only was this dumpster fire a critical and commercial failure, even the actors who were somehow duped into taking the role were burned to their core in regret over ever accepting it. During a 2011 interview with The Guardian, actor Bob Hoskins was asked, "What's the worst you've done?" Without hesitation, he answered, "Super Mario Bros." Next, he was asked about his greatest disappointment ever. His answer, Super Mario Bros. Finally, he was asked the one thing he would change in his life if he could edit the past. His response, "I wouldn't do Super Mario Bros."
Yikes.
The film ultimately landed a 29% Rotten Tomatoes score among both audiences and critics, a rare tie in opinions between the two groups. One critic review posted to RT in 2010 reads, "As the ad campaign helpfully pointed out, this ain't no game. It's a live-action thrill ride. Half true, it is surely not a game, for it is typically held that games are pleasurable." Some other critics were slightly more positive in their views, with another stating, "Bizarre, replete and often stunning special effects, and very strange from the outset. Super Mario Bros. Is curiously entertaining, even though it often makes little sense." The one silver lining of the movie is the fact that Danny DeVito was initially offered the role of Mario and turned it down, demonstrating that even though Frank may be the trash man, even he wasn't willing to eat that garbage.
I'm the trash man. I come out, I throw trash all over the ring, and then I start eating garbage. And then I pick up the trash can and I smash the guy on the head.
Oh, that's gonna be a disaster.
No, nobody's gonna get hurt.
In 1994, a director named James Yukich stepped up to the plate and readied his bat to take another swing at video game movie stardom. His source material? The beat-em-up video game Double Dragon, which released onto arcades in 1987. And would you know it, this movie solved all of the problems present in the Super Mario Bros. Movie from a year prior, and went on to win 2 Oscars, a Golden Joystick Award, 3 Grammys, the Pulitzer Prize, and a Purple Heart. No, of course I'm lying. This is the Cursed Era, and there's no rest for the video game fan in the Cursed Era. The movie was obliterated by critics and fans because of its lack of adherence to the source material, the abysmal acting on display, pitifully bad dialogue, and a rushed, sloppy plot. Though most everything about the film is a beautiful demonstration of horrifying mediocrity on display, the special effects were at least acknowledged to be pretty alright. In one case, a boat chase sequence ended in a large explosion which was created using a ridiculous 700 gallons of gasoline and 200 gallons of alcohol. The crew of the film had several broadcasts made to local news stations the night before the stunt in order to warn the locals about the imminent explosion. Even with the heads up, some NPCs from the nearby city stumbled over the Double Dragon deuces they dropped in their jeans as they ran for the phone to call emergency services. Over 200 calls were recorded the night of the boat explosion. Little did these poor people know, the real bomb was the release of the movie a few months later. It only grossed $4.1 million worldwide and sits at 26% user score on Rotten Tomatoes, 3 points lower than the vaunted Super Mario Bros. Movie that preceded it. Critics were even less pleased with the film, dubbing it with a traumatic 11% and saying things like, "Even at 11 years old, I knew Double Dragon sucked," and "The set looked like a cheapo version of Blade Runner." Even the positive reviews of the movie seemed tepid and backhanded. Joy Layden of the Moving Picture Show gave the film a 2.5 out of 4 and said, "There is a genial exuberance to the lead performances of Wolf and Dacascos, who behave as though the Lee brothers aren't too many rungs above Beavis and Butthead on the evolutionary ladder." Only a month after the rip-roaring success of the Double Dragon film, another Hollywood masterpiece was released to the public. The film starred Jean-Claude Van Damme and Raoul Julia, the latter of whom was apparently so ashamed of the atrocity of a film that he was involved in that he died of pure embarrassment shortly before the film's theatrical release. Now, the film was shredded on a number of grounds, including the abominable acting, a lack of adherence to the source material, and of course a comically over-the-top and poorly written plot. I will say, even with the complaints, the character design and casting choices aren't so bad in spite of the painful acting. I mean, if we are supposed to give Bella Ramsey a pass in the Last of Us HBO show as Ellie...
Sorry, I just think I'm too stupid to understand this.
Jean-Claude Van Damme certainly cuts it in the film adaptation for Major Guile. In an interview, the director, D'Souza, said that he did not want to force elements of Street Fighter II into his film, and even cited the Super Mario Bros. Movie from the prior year as an example of a poor adaptation. Bold words for a fellow whose film netted a new record low of 20% user score on Rotten Tomatoes, a solid 9 points lower than the movie he had regrettably badmouthed.
Fucking embarrassing!
The less video game inclined among us, aka the movie critics, were nearly all appalled. Reading the critic reviews for Street Fighter feels like skimming the obituary for one of history's more reprehensible ex-painters.
What do you mean by that?
One reads, "The film is based on the popular video game and plays as a pathetically incoherent attempt to accommodate all the characters kids want to see come to life on the big screen." While another simply states, "It assaults the ears and the intellect." A handful of other reviewers had not even bothered to write anything in regards to their opinions, opting instead to let their 1s and 0 out of 5s do the talking. Regardless of reception, the film netted a pretty hefty $99 million globally, accruing a solid profit. I would speculate this is due to brand name recognition, but Super Mario was certainly no slouch in that department, and it absolutely ate pavement on its release, so that's likely not the case. The next film, perhaps more than any other in this early era, I have to be careful with what I say. Compared to any other video game movie from the time, it is one of the most highly rated among both critics and users, netting an RT score of 47% and 57% respectively. Admire that 57, baby, because that is a thing of beauty for this era of Inception. The film I'm referring to is the first Mortal Kombat movie. In spite of the mature and controversial nature of the MK games during the 90s, the movie's creators decided to stay away from the more graphic elements found in the arcade and soon-to-be-released console experiences, so the movie was slapped with a PG-13 rating. During production, the producers had the ratings board on speed dial to run scripts and scenes by them. One of the things learned in these sessions was that they were not allowed to show any human characters die on screen while maintaining a PG-13 rating. Non-humans, however, were fair game. So, the movie took every opportunity to show the lesser species meeting their demise on screen in order to make up for an upsetting lack of fatalities. Another thing that helped make up for the lack of brutal violence was the theme song, which is unironically an utter banger. The movie was met with less than fanfare on its release. The critic masses had a mixed bag, leaning heavily towards the negative. The movie seemed to really stir emotions, as some of these reviews were quite brutal. Scott Weinberg writes that viewing Mortal Kombat is, quote, like watching a lot of sweaty fistfights while trapped in the world's loudest nightclub. Another reviewer casually notes that if the movie Mortal Kombat were a character in a Mortal Kombat video game, its special maneuver would be to climb on its opponent's shoulders and defecate on its head, while giving the film an F rating. Not all comments were as brutal as Mortal Kombat fatalities, however. Bruce Kirkland of Jam Movies said the movie offers a visceral jolt of pleasure for those who formerly believed the martial arts movie genre belongs exclusively to Hong Kong's John Woo, though if he said that of his own accord or under threat of execution, still is yet to be established. The exact reception in '95 is difficult to pin down, as there's been somewhat of a nostalgic reassessment of the movie in the past decade. The previously mentioned 57% Rotten Tomatoes score from users is in no small part due to reviews from the mid to late 2010s and beyond. One thing that hasn't changed, however, is the absolute crapfest that was the sequel, Mortal Kombat Annihilation. Annihilation was released in 1997, a few very short years after the original Mortal Kombat film, and was loosely based off of Mortal Kombat 3. It was directed by John R. Leonetti as his first film in the directorial role. A part of me thinks that if studios responsible for video game film adaptations had stopped putting first-time directors at the helm on these projects, some of them might have turned out better. But neither of these things happened with Annihilation. The movie stuck with the PG-13 rating, disappointing gorehounds, but more tragically was just mind-blowingly abysmal in every aspect. Video game movies up to this point were generally given marginal praise in one department: special effects. Annihilation had garbage effects, screech-worthy acting, a record scratch of a plot, and was so bad that the planned third film was scrapped entirely. The producer of the film, Lawrence Kasanoff, explicitly mentioned in an interview that the special effects were literally not completed, but the studio had the film shipped anyway because they wanted the quick cash grab. To this point, R.L. Schaefer, a contributor for IGN, later wrote, "Mortal Kombat Annihilation is a bad movie. No way around it. Over the years, however, it has evolved into a cult hit of sorts, playing as an unintentional comedy, a spoof of the early video game movies and their painfully obvious cash-in mentality." The sequel has netted an impressively tragic 4% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, though the user score still hovers around 26%. One user review summarizes the film thus: CGI worse than in the video game it's inspired by, acting at the same level as in a kindergarten stage play, and about as much depth as the lead in a pencil. Mortal Kombat Annihilation is hilariously bad and ridiculously brainless. Next up, a new challenger enters the fray, the woman Lara Croft herself, or in this case, Angelina Jolie, who can't seem to make any facial expressions other than pouty lips and open mouth breather, both of which I think were meant to be interpreted as sexy. Don't take my judgment at face value, however, as Jolie's performance was one of the only things viewers gave a slight pass. Speaking of sexuality, demonstrating how times have changed, Angelina Jolie had mentioned how she doesn't feel that the final Lara in the film is sexy enough. This is in reference to a handful of scenes which were cut from the script, or final product, including a rear nudity scene which used a body double, a second shower scene, separate from the one already included in the film, a scene in which she flashes some gooners, a moment where Lara obliterates a giant centipede with her boobs, another instance of nudity where she loses her bikini to a wild animal, and plenty of other scenes of varying degrees of undress and sexualization. Even with the cut content, the production had Jolie wear a padded bra to make her more consistent with her video game counterpart. Truly a crazy time. With each time the script was handed to a new pair of eyes and rewritten, more nudity was lost. Oh, to think what these absolute monsters stole from us. I jest, of course, but man, maybe if they'd left some of these moments in, they might have squeaked out another few percentage points on the audience score, which hits at 47%, ranking just below Mortal Kombat. It also grossed a nutty $274 million. Incredibly, up until the release of the 2023 Super Mario Bros. Movie, Lara Croft Tomb Raider was the highest-grossing video game film adaptation to date. Earnings aside, however, the film continued a now storied tradition of poor writing, incoherent plot, and a lack of emotional resonance. Now, this isn't to suggest that there wasn't any kind of resonance with some critics. James Sanford of the Kalamazoo Gazette wrote in 2002, "Most of the chase sequences feature more jiggle than you'd get in a Three's Company marathon. As her astounding exercise regimen shows, Lara treats her body like a temple. Many will worship it." This is an incredible thing to say in public, let alone say without a hint of irony. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Jimmy O from Film Snobs writes about the same time, saying, "More than just being a terrible movie, Tomb Raider is a disturbing exercise in the mythologies of sexuality." I've read this a few times now and I still don't know what it means, but I can't help but think Jimmy O is just upset by boobs.
Deep underground, in a top secret research lab, security has been breached. A deadly virus capable of contaminating the entire world has been released.
The next movie on our list is directed by a returning star, Paul W.S. Anderson, the very same gentleman who was behind the tepidly, though well-received in comparison to every other adaptation to this point, Mortal Kombat movie. And would you know it, Mr. Anderson has an apparent knack for creating passable video game movie slop. His second foray into the space was with an adaptation for the survival horror game Resident Evil, which was released in 1996.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
But Chris is...
What is it?
Notably, this is the first film in the listing to be slapped with a solid R rating. In fact, the film was apparently so offensive to the sensitivities of the MPAA that early cuts were earning NC-17 ratings, and the film had to be edited down to fit the slightly less controversial category of R. The swearing, gore, and mature content was simply at a level that had not been seen before in video game movies. The original script for the film was a project written by Anderson entitled Undead. It would seem Anderson is a bit of a gamer himself, and after releasing the Mortal Kombat movie, he found time to play through Resident Evil, and immediately saw potential for a film. Instead of writing an RE film, however, he blatantly ripped it off in his own script, entitled Undead, which later became the basis for the actual Resident Evil movie. Once again, it was mentioned that the film would avoid attempting to stick to the source material too closely, because at this point, directors were clearly seeing the trend of absolute garbage coming out of their productions, and for some reason, blamed it on adhering to source material, not abysmal filmmaking. The movie's ties to Resident Evil video game titles are very slim, sometimes as minor as the presence of crows, which are an enemy in the game, photographs in the style of some of the game, or camera angles and shots inspired by the interactive experience. In spite of attempting to distance themselves a few degrees from the games, the movie has found itself in a shockingly positive, though divisive position. The user score rests at a balmy 67 on Rotten Tomatoes, even though the critic score is still a mid-30s. This places Resident Evil as the highest rated video game to film adaptation up to this point, followed by the previous film by the same director, Mortal Kombat. Well, what do you know? She's back. The not sexy enough Lara Croft in her second outing, The Cradle of Life. This movie released in 2003, a few short years after the initial film, and why wouldn't it when the previous installment made the absurd money that it did? The turnaround on this film was quick, with the actual filming only lasting a few months. The production itself was not exactly smooth if the director, Jan de Bont, is to be believed. In an interview with Mike Ryan, an entertainment writer, DeBoont recounts that the studio interfered with the film from day one, being courteous enough to give him a call on the first day of shooting to let him know that they were removing $12 million from the movie's budget, in spite of the havoc it would wreak on the intended script. He also tells an anecdote about a male lead whose name he forgot, but was likely Gerard Butler or Kieran Hines, who called him personally because they didn't like the buttons on their shirt. DeBoont also expressed frustration that the creators of the video game were involved with the process and had a say in the story, though nobody had informed him that this was going to be the case prior. As far as I'm concerned, this all seems like great plausible deniability for DeBoont, and a way to shift some of the blame for the movie being so painfully mid, but he seems to be content rather to just give interviews in 2020 to tabloid entertainment journalism. Even his positive comments on Angelina Jolie were weirdly muddled and mixed, saying things like, "She was difficult to work with, but for me it was probably not a problem," though he ultimately admitted to liking her very much, probably as a result of that temple of a body she had acquired from her clearly astounding exercise routine. Unfortunately for the Goon Squad, the production relented on the boob pads in the sequel, further reducing the movie's sexuality. At the end of the day, the film was received slightly worse by audience members with a score of 44% in comparison to the original's 47%. In spite of the turmoil and cut budget, the production still managed to squeak out $160 million globally. Critics were just confused and upset as usual, with a few exceptions. Matt Brunson from the wildly popular Creative Loafing scalds the film, saying, "The pace can be best described as similar to crawling through quicksand with 2 broken legs and a refrigerator strapped to your back." On the more positive side, a horned-up Blake DiPastino, writing for a local city newspaper, states, "It's all confection, but the plot is tight, Jolie is hot, and I'll probably see the next one too." That, my friends, is high praise. As the year 2003 drew to a whimpering close, so did the first decade of video game to movie adaptations. Strangely, as time has gone on, a number of these films, including Mortal Kombat and the Super Mario Bros. Movie, have gained a cult following of people who genuinely enjoy them. I'm not saying that people are wrong for liking such historical classics, but with taste like that, I would be mortified to see their Spotify Wrapped. Again, there are a few more films in this time period that I simply skipped over entirely. And no, I didn't watch every film on this list or the ones to come, because if I did, then once this abysmal project was done and dusted, that would be well over 40 films that I would have to slog through, which would take more time and commitment than a marriage. With all that out of the way, I want to thank you for watching this video. I did most of the research and wrote much of the script for this video on a laptop in my truck at 4:45 in the morning before work and on lunch breaks, because time has rapidly vanished to non-existence, making these videos a virtual impossibility to create. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch it. And if you did enjoy it, a like, or even better, a subscription, would make my effort all the more worth it. Plus, you'll see when part 2 of this series goes live. Finally, if you feel so inclined, take a look at the Deep Fried Gaming Podcast on all of the major podcast streaming platforms. It's hosted by myself and one of my best bees, RJ, who also posts on this very channel, by the way. We cover all sorts of topics ranging from game reviews to roasts and retrospectives. If that sounds like your cup of tea, give it a listen. Until next time, we'll see ya.